Welcome to the third session of the KU class, Biography of a City, Lawrence. My name is Dennis Domer, the coordinator of this course. This evening we have two speakers from the university community, Dale Nimz, who I'll introduce immediately, and David Katzman. Dale Nimz will be speaking on the topic, Building the Historic City, Workers' Housing, and Workers' Neighborhoods. Dale received his BA degree in history from Kansas State University, and then went on to George Washington University in our nation's capital to receive an MA in American Studies with a concentration in historic preservation in 1984. He is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Kansas studying United States history with a concentration in North American environmental history. His projected dissertation topic is change in the popular perception of the Kansas River from the 19th to the 20th century, looking at the relationship of land use planning in the Kansas River Valley. Since 1980, Dale has worked as a historic preservation survey manager in Johnson County, Kansas, a preservation planner for the city of St. Joseph, Missouri, and he is currently a historic preservation consultant in Kansas City and Missouri. He is a member of the Lawrence Historic Resources Commission and a former member of the Kansas Preservation Alliance. Some of the information for his lecture this evening is based on his research entitled Living with History, a Historic Preservation Plan for Lawrence, Kansas, prepared in 1983 for the city of Lawrence and funded by a grant from the Kansas Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service. Dale, thank you for coming.
Tonight I will call your attention to an area of Lawrence that generally has not been recognized as significant in local history. It's a workers' neighborhood, East Lawrence. And even though the early town developed with roughly equal-sized residential districts on both sides of Massachusetts Street, the east side, or East Lawrence, has been left out of the popular image of Lawrence. I'd like you to think about why that occurred as I present some findings and conclusions based on a general study of East Lawrence and a particular group of houses that still stand on the 700 and 800 blocks on the east side of the 700 and 800 blocks of Rhode Island Street. On the overhead here, you can see a copy of Holland Wheeler's early map of Lawrence. This was done circa 1860. We can see the bridge over the Kansas River, which was actually constructed in 1863. And the yellow line in the center is Massachusetts Street. In fact, if I can get the pointer, I'll show that. Yeah. So right there, almost exactly in the center of the map and in the center of the city is Massachusetts Street. The east side of Massachusetts is East Lawrence, and the west is West Lawrence, part of which is now known as Old West Lawrence. Before the end of the 19th century, Lawrence was well known as the historic city of Lawrence, or historic city of Kansas, excuse me. This distinction was based on the dramatic events related to the early conflict over slavery and statehood from 1854 to 1863. But the years immediately after Quantrill's destructive raid in 1863 actually, in my opinion, were more important in the town's growth. During this town building period, many houses in East Lawrence were constructed within walking distance of transportation, industrial and commercial enterprises, and social institutions. If I can have the pointer again. There, okay. If this is East Lawrence, Massachusetts Street being its western boundary, the river its northern boundary, and on the far eastern boundary is Delaware Street, the eastern boundary of East Lawrence and also of Lawrence during this historic period. Even before the dramatic population growth that began in 1864, Settlers from diverse origins actually outnumbered New Englanders in Lawrence. Lawrence was much more than a New England town. It was shaped by the same processes of urbanization and industrialization which affected most other 19th century towns west of the Missouri River. East Lawrence was an essential part of the town's historic, social, and urban structure. Residents east of Massachusetts were essential because their work on the railroads, in construction, agricultural processing, and manufacturing actually made the town grow. Detailed study of the houses on Rhode Island Street demonstrates that the town building period from 1864 to 1873 was especially significant in town's history, and that several groups besides New England immigrants contributed to that development. Understanding the history of East Lawrence helps correct an unbalanced view of the town's development. And I argue that the people of East Lawrence were left out of local history because the area became identified with economic failure, vice, and deterioration after 1900. By the 1970s, East Lawrence became the target of redevelopment plans that would have destroyed part of the neighborhood to provide better access to downtown and to the Kansas River Bridge. Now, at the beginning of the crucial historic period, when the Kansas Pacific Railroad reached North Lawrence in 1864, traffic into town was concentrated at the Massachusetts Street Bridge, and we saw that on the map. When immigrants began to arrive by the railroad, one newcomer from Illinois was so by the rebuilding after Quantrill's raid that he commented early in 1865 that this is bound to be the city in Kansas. Lawrence was a busy place during this period. The Kansas Tribune reported in 1866, for example, that a large number of houses are being erected in different parts of the city, but the demand is also increasing at a much more rapid rate. Development of East Lawrence was stimulated by construction of the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad Bridge in 1867 at the head of Delaware Street, so that the bridge is not that particular bridge is not shown on this map because it's an earlier map. Could I have the pointer? Okay, there it is. But it would be on the far to the right of the pointer at the head of Delaware Street. 8 blocks east of Massachusetts, Delaware became the eastern boundary of what developed as East Lawrence. After the Lawrence, Leavenworth, and Galveston Railroad Depot was constructed, the neighborhood was centered between 2 important north-south routes. Milling and manufacturing enterprises then clustered along the river between the 2 bridges. Houses in East Lawrence were conveniently located within walking distance of the railroad to the east, industry to the north, and businesses on Massachusetts Street to the west. By the end of the town building period, the 4th Ward of Lawrence, north of 9th Street in East Lawrence, was largely developed. Of the 20 surviving houses on the 700 and 800 blocks of Rhode Island Street, especially the east side, about half were erected soon after the Civil War. Even more directly than East Lawrence, North Lawrence was created by the railroad, and that neighborhood also was influenced by the development of manufacturing and agricultural processing. Like East Lawrence, North Lawrence became a neighborhood of small businesses, the homes of skilled and production workers, as well as a center of the black community in Lawrence. By the mid-1870s, North Lawrence had all the elements of an independent community. Along with business districts on North 2nd and Locust Streets, the community had distinct neighborhoods, churches, schools, homes, and North Lawrence especially was famous for its gardens. Now, Lawrence enjoyed the rewards of being the Western Railroad terminus, which it achieved after 1864, for less than 2 years, until about 1866. Afterwards, regional trade declined, but several manufacturing operations were started, including the production of farm implements, carriages and wagons, soap, furniture, chemicals, and an iron foundry which had been founded before statehood was enlarged after that time. Building the railroad also brought Irish and French Canadian laborers to town. Blacks had been coming to Lawrence since the outbreak of the Civil War, and significant numbers of German and Scandinavian immigrants were also attracted to Lawrence during this boom period. This period of growth and high expectations ended abruptly in the nationwide recession of 1873, which lasted for several years. Lawrence and Douglas County had issued a total of $900,000 in railroad bonds to support railroad construction, and that debt after 1873 became a crushing burden on the taxpayers of the city and the county. Early in 1874, the Lawrence Journal edited, quote, "We must retrench. The people are poor. The times are hard and show no signs of getting easier," end quote. That same year, the crops of Douglas County were devastated by a plague of grasshoppers and drought. Residents began to leave for more secure settlements in the east and for possible opportunities in the west. Thus, in the late 1870s, a long period of population stability and economic conservatism in Lawrence began. For the next 60 years, until World War II essentially, the town's population increased by less than 10% each decade. In the late 1870s, the most numerous immigrants to Lawrence, black Southerners, were received with considerable ambivalence. In the 1880 census, African Americans represented 22.5% of the town's population, the highest proportion in local history. Although there was no strictly segregated district in Lawrence, black residents tended to concentrate in East Lawrence and North Lawrence. The African Methodist Episcopal Church at 9th and New York, 2 blocks east of the German-American Turn Hall on Rhode Island Street, was the center of the black community in Lawrence. The rich history of African Americans in Lawrence and their role as workers in the local economy remains to be documented and interpreted. And I don't have the information and I really can't go on with that tonight, but that's a very rich subject for someone to develop. As I said earlier, manufacturing became the economic hope of the community in the late 19th century after the boom ended. The dam on the Kansas River was completed in 1874. It was partially destroyed by high water, and then finally ran in 1876. And it really began to effectively produce power in 1878. It was a considerable engineering problem for the time to build an effective dam on the Kansas River. Another topic that's worthy of discussion. Power from the water wheel was transmitted to enterprises near the river by cable, so that the manufacturing clustered along the river. Building a dam on the river was an attempt to solve the problem of the high cost of power. Wood for fuel was becoming scarce in Lawrence as early as 1869, and transportation costs made coal expensive to import to Lawrence, since it was on the western frontier at this time. During the 1880s, however, Lawrence benefited from the personal energy and wealth of J.D. Bowersock, who led the manufacturers using the water power. He inherited the dam and the Douglas County Mills in 1879 and later bought the Lawrence Paper Company. Bowersock also held directorships in the Consolidated Barbed Wire Company and the Griffin Ice Company, which operated by cutting and storing ice from the large pool of still water backed up by the Kansas River Dam during the winter. Another flour mill near the dam was established by the Pearson brothers in 1879 and flourished until it was destroyed by fire in 1900, and the Pearson brothers did not choose to rebuild after that. At the east edge of East Lawrence and Lawrence proper, the Lawrence Canning Company was established in 1881. By the early 1890s, the company produced 1 million cans of food and was one of the largest inland canneries in the country. Along with the dam, the Barbed Wire Company, Consolidated Barbed Wire, was the most important industrial development in the late 19th century in Lawrence. By 1898, the company provided the main justification for Lawrence's claim to be a manufacturing center. When the barbed wire company was acquired by U.S. Steel in January of 1899 and shut down, the town lost its most important business in terms of payroll, number of employees, and the amount of capital invested. In the years after it closed, the University of Kansas became the dominant economic institution of Lawrence, and that remains true today. So that is the general outline and context for East Lawrence, and I'd like to take a closer look at the actual process of town building on Rhode Island Street. During the settlement period, that is before Quantrill's raid, before the arrival of the railroad, there were no New Englanders on the 700 and 800 blocks of Rhode Island Street. O.W. McAllister from New York and Henry Martin, who despite his name was actually born in Germany, that is a German immigrant, were the earliest residents. During the settlement period, Rhode Island Street was on the eastern edge of development. The town was, or the settlement was actually quite small. Both the McAllister and the Martin houses survived Quantrill's raid, and the McAllister house I will show you later, and what remains of the Martin house. They still stand. They survived perhaps because they were masonry buildings widely separated from other buildings in the middle of undeveloped blocks. But that landscape changed quickly after 1863. The Lawrence Tree on July 28, 1865, new and substantial buildings rising as by magic all over this plateau we call a city. After the railroad reached Lawrence, it brought diverse people, popular ideas, and industrially produced materials to the town. 15 houses then were constructed on the east side of the 700 and 800 blocks of Rhode Island Street during this town building period. The population of the 4th Ward north of 9th Street in East Lawrence also peaked in the 1870 census. A relatively stable set of residents and property owners was formed during this period, which persisted into the late 19th century. Probably the most important single group, at least that I was able to identify on Rhode Island Street and in the immediate vicinity, were German Americans. They concentrated on the east side during the town building period. German immigrants, numerous property owners on the 700 and 800 blocks of Rhode Island. They may have been attracted first by Henry Martin's house, which was used as a boarding house, and afterwards by the most important historic building in East Lawrence. Built in 1869 at the corner of 9th and Rhode Island Street, the massive stone turn hall was the social center for German Americans in Lawrence. Rhode Island Street property owners such as Henry Martin, Carl Weiler, Charles Ackning, Julius Fisher, Simon and Leo Steinberg, and Fred Dyckman were all charter members of the Turnverein, the society which carried on its activities in the Turn Hall. Besides the Turnverein, which hosted a variety of social, educational, and athletic activities, German Methodist and German Evangelical churches in East Lawrence. New York School was constructed in 1865, 2 blocks east of Rhode Island Street, to serve the neighborhood's children. So there are 3 main buildings and institutions: the school, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and also the German Turn Hall, all in very close proximity. Most early residents on Rhode Island Street had businesses or places of business on Massachusetts Street. In the town building period, for example, Henry Martin and Charles Ackning were saloon keepers. This is before Prohibition, of course. Kansas Prohibition, I mean. In the town building period, Simon and Leo Steinberg were partners in a clothing store. Fred Dyckman was a butcher, but the most prosperous and the most wealthy member of the Rhode Island Street property owners. The butcher had an ice business. He later had other businesses. Carl Weiler was a house and sign painter. So those are the occupations of some of the main German settlers. There were other residents on Rhode Island Street, including European immigrants and Westerners. That is, people who had, from the Midwest, west of the Appalachians, who moved further west into Kansas. Hannah Williamson, a widow living on Rhode Island Street, was born in Ireland. Lewis Peterson was a stonemason who had immigrated from Sweden. Harrison Hatch, a livery and feed stable owner, was born in Ohio and came to Kansas from Illinois. So there's an example of what I call a Westerner, what James Malin also called a Westerner. In the 1870s, however, some early residents, and the most prominent example is O.W. McAllister, left Reet, moving to West Lawrence. And it's this trend, among others, that contributed to the decline of the neighborhood in the late 19th and early 20th century. When we look at the houses on Rhode Island Street, and I'll show you some slides in a few minutes, you'll see that European cultural origins were not really expressed in the particular form and style of individual residences on Rhode Island Street. German Americans constructed different types of houses, and they also chose buildings that were much like those chosen by the other settlers in Lawrence. The streetscape itself also resulted from uneven development. Because town building proceeded so quickly at first and then ended so abruptly, scattered lots throughout Lawrence were unimproved for several years, and this pattern is found on Rhode Island Street. That means then that several different historical periods are often found on the same block or in the same street. In the years from 1874 to 1915, after the end of the town building period, some new houses did fill in vacant lots on Rhode Island Street. The most notable investment came from outside and indicated the decisive change to a working class neighborhood during this time period. Two groups of houses were constructed by capitalists J.D. Bowersock and J.N. Roberts. In 1890, Bowersock built 3 adjacent houses, and we'll see those in the slides, in the 700 block that were rented, that were strictly for rental housing, usually rented to railroad and industrial workers in this early period. Roberts built 3 houses on the corner lots at 8th and Rhode Island Street in 1901. So what's happening here, more and more people and houses are being concentrated on Rhode Island Street and generally throughout East Lawrence. More of these houses are being rented to wage workers, and also more of the new property owners are native-born and not foreign immigrants. After 1915, no new buildings were constructed on the 700 and 800 blocks of Rhode Island Street. And I have a view of Rhode Island Street. And I'll need the pointer. I'll show you the slides later, but if we move from north and we'll go south, I'll show you a slide of the Julius Fisher House, which is at Rhode Island Street, 1869. Hannah Williamson's house is next a little bit later. Then the Bowersock rental houses, the McAllister House is in the middle of this block. Carl Weiler's house, he has 2 houses actually. We'll see both of those. The Steinberg House, a house which has recently been threatened with demolition. And here is a void in the streetscape. As late as 1955, there was a house from the town building period here, and I have a photograph from a thesis that was done in 1945 showing that house, but that's been a vacant lot now for more than 25 years. And also there's a vacant lot and a parking lot down at the end of the 800 block. The Roberts rental houses are here. The Dyckman house is here. And the Peterson house, which I'll also show you, which is an interesting house, is almost in the middle of the block. And then there's some other houses that are basically later houses that fill in. But all those were constructed by 1915. Now, in East Lawrence, which is really the largest residential neighborhood in the historic city, 85% of the residences in the neighborhood were constructed before 1945. This is based on a historic preservation survey of Lawrence, which was done a couple years ago. Only 6 buildings that we know of date from the town building, or from the settlement period, that very early period when Lawrence was a frontier community, essentially. Approximately 200 residences were constructed during just the few years of the town building period. 9 years, less than a decade. Only 130 houses throughout the whole neighborhood then were built in the late 19th century, and more than 300 were constructed during the long period of slow growth from 1900 to 1945. So that is the largest group, but those houses were also constructed over the longest period of time. Can I have the slides, please? All right. This is the McAllister House. O.W. McAllister, 724 Rhode Island. This is a house that has been listed on the Lawrence Register of Historic Places, and we believe that this house survived Quantrill's raid. Next slide, please. Oh, I can do that. And this is what remains. I'm sorry this is not a very good slide. These are all current. These are less than 2 weeks old. What remains of the Henry Martin House, which was a large stone building, and it's now used as an outbuilding. And the corner shows stonework, if you can make that out. Those are the 2 structures that date back to the settlement period. And this is the Turn Hall. And as I said, I consider this the most important historic building in East Lawrence, and one of the most beautiful, too, and one of the most beautiful buildings in Lawrence. The Julius Fisher House, a larger version of the townhouse plan that we saw in the McAllister House. This is at 702 Rhode Island on the corner. The Steinberg House, a frame version, slightly modified. This is at the other end of the 700 block from the Fisher House. It's been recited. It may not look like much, but this is a circa 1870 building. The Dyckman House is much better preserved, an I house, called the I House because it's associated with, again, those Westerners, the people from Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois. It has a wing extending to the rear. It's a brick. Carl Weiler's residence in the 700 block, but a very similar house type, only this is in wood frame, the other was in brick. An I house with a central entrance. This is immediately next door to the north. This is also Carl Weiler's house. I haven't done enough research on Carl Weiler to know why he had 2 houses. I assume that one was a rental. This is a brick house, the other was a frame house. In the city directories, he's listed at the frame house. Why he would choose to live in the wooden house as opposed to the brick house, I don't know. This is the Urbanski Freshman House. Mr. Urbanski built this house, lived in it just a few years, and left town at the end of the boom period. It's a slightly different house type. One of the things that this house shows is that it opens to the rear so that the street level has changed. Grade has been filled in around the base of this house. It originally had a kind of walkout exit and entrance to the rear. Another very modest appearing house. This is how it appears from the street. The front is a frame addition. And the main part of the house actually stone, cut stone that's been painted, and this is what it looks like from the rear. And this is the Louis Peterson house, built by the Swedish stonemason that I mentioned in 1881. And this is actually fairly late for a stone building, a stone residence in Lawrence. Another later house, probably built about 1886, probably replacing an earlier wood frame house. This is the house that Hannah Williamson, the widow who had immigrated from Ireland, occupied. A fairly large and comfortable house for East Lawrence. How a widow was able to do this, I don't know. There's a story there. And these are the Bowersock rental houses. There are 3 of them. What we would call late Victorian folk houses. And this is one of the J. N. Roberts rental houses built in 1901. Also Victorian in its porch and so on. So those are some of the houses on Rhode Island Street. And there are many more houses very similar to these scattered throughout East Lawrence. These are fairly typical. Some of the houses here are earlier. There are not very many settlement period houses in the rest of East Lawrence. And as you go south in East Lawrence, there are more bungalows and later period houses. The farther south you go, the more later houses there are. These are earlier, by and large. The question I would ask then, that I ask, and you might think about, what is the significance of East Lawrence and its houses in local history? I'll give you my answer to that. Large-scale permanent development in Lawrence did not occur until after the first New England immigrants had been absorbed into a larger population of settlers from diverse origins. All of the groups that contributed to early Lawrence, the New Englanders, Westerners from Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, African Americans, Germans, and other European immigrants, all contributed to the historic city. Town building created residential neighborhoods on both sides of the town's main street. During the town building period, East Lawrence had some particular advantages because of its strategic location in relation to the river and the railroads. But the neighborhood became less desirable over time, so that the most significant Rhode Island Street houses are associated with the transformation of Lawrence from a frontier settlement to a western boom town. After the boom collapsed in the mid-1870s, however, East Lawrence gradually became the most notorious part of town and was largely excluded from our recollection of local history. One historian has traced the prejudice back to the early days of settlement when conflicts over competing land claims and the fear of disease, probably malaria from the mosquitoes near the river, were associated with East Lawrence. But several factors combined to give the neighborhood a bad reputation in the 19th century, especially the late 19th century. Because it developed in response to railroad construction, East Lawrence was associated with the disastrous consequences of railroad bond debt. For decades after the collapse of the boom in 1873, economic opportunity in Lawrence was limited. This hurt the workmen and businessmen of East Lawrence, especially those who were foreign-born or black. In 1893, the old Leavenworth and Galveston Bridge was found to be in such poor condition, and this is in some ways reflective of the condition of the whole railroad company. It eventually went out of business and was purchased by another larger company. The bridge was in such bad condition that traffic had to be immediately suspended. And then later the tracks were torn out, the right-of-way was abandoned, the bridge was never repaired. But even after the railroad was gone, the area near the railroad crossing in the 700 and 800 blocks of Pennsylvania and Delaware Street, at the very north end of the map that I showed you, that area was known as the East Bottoms and remained the site of illegal liquor sales, gambling, and prostitution, such as there was in Lawrence. By 1917, an established prejudice towards East Lawrence was expressed in the Lawrence Survey. The early social scientists fixed on, quote, the east side or the bottoms, quote, as the worst part of town, where, quote, housing evils, end quote, existed that were unrealized by the good people of Lawrence. Calling attention to a relatively small problem area, the surveyors actually defamed the whole neighborhood. While describing the Fourth Ward as the near slum section of Lawrence, the surveyors noted that outside the bottoms are found a number of attractive homes. The Rhode Island Street houses are examples of the better homes in East Lawrence and reflect the fact that most of East Lawrence, outside the bottoms, in the early 20th century was occupied by working people who formed a relatively stable community. By that time in Lawrence, professional and businessmen, along with their employees, were concentrated west of Massachusetts in the first and second city. The largest proportion of men in the skilled trades lived in East Lawrence in the third and the fourth wards. And also rental housing in Lawrence was concentrated in the fourth ward. The fourth ward also had the highest proportion of foreign-born residents in Lawrence. And beginning in 1914, anti-German sentiment mounted all over the United States. After the United States entered the war, World War I, in 1917, discrimination became so strong that German Americans in Lawrence stopped using the German language in their church services. And the Turnverein, for example, changed its name to the American Gymnastic Union to demonstrate their good citizenship. Eventually, the Turnverein disbanded and sold the Turn Hall, its Rhode Island Street Hall, in 1938. The suspicion of two world wars added to the negative image of East Lawrence. The distinctive contribution of German Americans to the historic city was nearly forgotten. By 1915, railroads, agriculture, and manufacturing had also become less important in Lawrence than the business of education. Development of the university shifted the focus of activity away from East Lawrence toward the southwest. Changes in transportation, first the construction of an electric trolley system, and then after World War I, especially in the 20s and into the early 30s, the growing use of the automobile meant that the convenience of living within walking distance of the river, Massachusetts Street, and other jobs was less important. So residences in East Lawrence were less desirable. The main electric streetcar route, for instance, extended in 1909 Pacific Depot in North Lawrence, across the river bridge, and south on Massachusetts Street to what is now 23rd Street. With additional routes to the university and to the east on 13th, the streetcar system in Lawrence reached its maximum extent during the years from 1922 to 1927. Streetcar transportation encouraged residential development to the south along Massachusetts Street, along that corridor. And the use of automobiles, the growing use, stimulated even more development in the 1920s that filled in and eventually burst out of the historic boundaries of Lawrence. Still, as late as 1938, a map of the town showed the original settlement plan with little expansion beyond the town boundaries outlined in 1873. Between 1940 and 1950, however, the town's population grew by 30%. The opening of the Sunflower Ordnance Plant in nearby Johnson County during World War II, early in World War II, and after the war, the influx of veterans to the university launched the modern era in Lawrence history, and we have not seen the end of that kind of growth since. During the years from 1917 to 1975, the physical environment of East Lawrence deteriorated. Houses constructed during the town building period showed signs of age, and some were poorly maintained. So that by 1972, city planning consultants warned that the neighborhood had reached an advanced state of deterioration in terms of structures, transportation facilities, and environmental blight. This analysis helped justify the proposed Haskell Loop, which would have ended at 7th and Connecticut Streets, separating the neighborhood from the river and from the railroad landmarks, important landmarks in its history. Construction of that highway would have also destroyed a number of residences. Now, since the 1970s, thousands of public and private dollars have been invested in housing rehabilitation in East Lawrence. Houses there often have been the best available value for first-time or moderate-income buyers, home buyers in Lawrence. But more than a good deal, the significant houses on Rhode Island Street are a valuable reminder of the urban structure and the architectural character of East Lawrence, and also of historic Lawrence as a city or as a town. And in that case, an appreciation of the East Side restores a balanced interpretation of local history and an authentic image of Lawrence as the historic city of Kansas.
Thank you. That ends the formal presentation. I think we have some time for interactions and questions for the students, and I'd like to open that up to you and see if there are any questions out there in the audience. Seems to be a little quiet this evening.
They're too
Dale?
polite, Dennis.
Perhaps they're too polite. Do you think black residences were really at any time clustered in a certain area in East Lawrence? They seem to have moved to a particular number of streets now. Did that happen?
I think that's an early pattern. In reviewing city directories, and there's good evidence in the city directories, it's just a tedious and time-consuming process to collect the information. It appears that, quote, colored residents of Lawrence, and they're designated that way in the city directories, tended to live in certain blocks and concentrate in certain blocks, and then also in other blocks adjacent to one another. So that, for instance, New York Street in East Lawrence, where the church is, it seems to me that the African Methodist Episcopal Church on New York Street serves as a kind of anchor institution, and people tend to live near that institution if they possibly can, so that there are a number of black residences on New York Street, for example. And there are similar patterns in West Lawrence, too, and also over in what is now the Pinckney neighborhood, so that certain blocks would have a high proportion of black residents. But the concentration does not seem to be entirely in East Lawrence or entirely in North Lawrence or in one single district, that there are concentrations scattered around the city. Yes, Katie?
Dale, did you find, or have you been able to research the number of people in East Lawrence that may have worked for the Consolidated Barbed Wire Company?
I haven't done that. I would like to do that. This
Arthur, Mr. Roberts,
right.
berry basket or wooden basket manufacturing.
No, I haven't done that detailed link. Basically, we're talking about record linking, so that we link residences with jobs. I'm inferring that because the industry was located in a certain pattern and the residences were located in a nearby, that presumably people walk to work. And the reason the Barbed Wire Company is so important is because it was kind of the flagship manufacturing institution. And not only did it provide work, but it provided subcontracts for the iron foundry and for other businesses, just like any flagship manufacturing plant. But that's a great job for somebody that wants to enter a lot of information into the computer and then print it out as maps of where people lived and where they worked. So I don't know the exact pattern. I don't know how the trades. Presumably, many of the people who worked at the barbed wire plant were relatively skilled. There was probably a hierarchy of skills. I think to match the relative higher skilled people with their houses and find out where those houses were. And I haven't done that. The cannery is another important business, and it's located on the east edge of Lawrence near where the railroad track was, for obvious reasons, for transportation reasons. The flour mills, of course, are another major employer. But I haven't really done. So basically, I'm putting this out as a strong hypothesis, I guess you would say. But I haven't linked it. The people on Rhode Island Street seem to be very clearly linked with Massachusetts Street, except for somebody like Fisher, whose ice business is also on the river. But that seems to be the orientation there. I would guess that people on Connecticut and New York streets farther to the east would tend to go north to the businesses.
You've indicated that as a result of the bottoms, the whole of East Lawrence became tainted.
Yeah, that's my opinion, yes.
In your opinion. I'm wondering if you could say that there developed then in the town a sense of people who lived in East Lawrence as living on the other side of the track, living on the other side of Massachusetts Street. Would you go so far as to say that there was a kind of ghettoization? And if you do believe that, how were those feelings explicitly manifested? In the newspapers, how were those particular attitudes of some people living on the other side of the tracks or the other side of Mass Street, some people living in this, using the term loosely, this ghettoized area? How are things then demonstrated?
Well, the most, I've given you most of what I have so far, and it's a circumstantial case. The other thing that I don't have in this paper, there are discussions of vice, for instance, and gambling. The Bottoms, say after 1900, the Bottoms become a place where male college students are sometimes caught, or there are legal cases where they're found over there, and the newspaper then rails against the site because it seems to attract and corrupt these college students. So that's a problem. There are also comments in the newspaper about men of ill repute who make their way west towards Massachusetts Street. And it's clear that there is a kind of social geography, that vice is more or less tolerated as long as it stays in its place, and its place is on the edge of the town in this kind of northeast part of East Lawrence. And if it remains there, it can be tolerated, but if it moves toward the heart of the city, Massachusetts Street, then that must be resisted. The newspaper comments on like that. Since illegal liquor is a big issue, and East Lawrence is one of the places where it can be obtained through the back doors of houses and so on. Kansas, has prohibition from the 1880s on, even before national prohibition. So obtaining liquor, which people seem determined to do, was a major problem. Lawrence was probably the center of that activity. And I think it has to do partly with the connection with the railroad. It was easier to bring it in, slip it in on the railroad, disperse it over there. I think that probably the vice, my own feeling, although I don't have very much evidence for this, is that the concentration of vice in the East Bottoms, which is this area right near the railroad crossing. When the railroad bridge was built and when the Lawrence, Leavenworth, and Galveston Railroad was being built further south, that area was a railroad construction camp. And railroad construction camps throughout the West are notorious for attracting gambling, liquor, and prostitution. So what I'm thinking is that was the nucleus of this in Lawrence, for instance, or at least one of the nuclei of this kind of activity in Lawrence was right after the bridge was constructed in 1867. It developed there, and then it persisted from then on. As far as ghettoization, the social survey obviously has a poor opinion of East Lawrence and expresses it, so that's one of the most explicit sources of evidence. I don't think that I think it's a fairly kind of implicit discrimination, and it's not as explicit as it would. The lines aren't as hard as they might be in other places, in Lawrence at least. The lines are relatively soft, but East Lawrence is definitely looked down upon.
But is it not true that after a certain period of time, it becomes increasingly difficult for African Americans to buy homes in Old West Lawrence, and certainly as the western and the southern parts of the town begin to develop in the middle of the, certainly from the end of World War I, well through the 50s into really the early 60s, it's very, very difficult for an African American family to move into those parts of town. So seems to me that East Lawrence and North Lawrence also becomes associated in people's minds not only with working class homes, but specifically with African American homes as well as Mexican American homes. Is that an erroneous
No,
assumption?
I think you're describing the pattern pretty accurately, although it hasn't really, it's not been comprehensively studied by any means, but I think that is an accurate. When I talked about how the streetcar system and the automobile allowed dispersal and spreading of the city, part of it is movement away from the worst parts of town and the worst parts of people. I think it's working class, discrimination against the workers, discrimination against African Americans, and it's also discrimination against foreign-born or foreign language speakers as well, which is more ethnicity, basically, and that's an issue in Lawrence that becomes, it's more important in the late 19th and early 20th century, but the German Americans really go underground after World War I, and they pretty much assimilate quietly. They don't present their Germanness at all. But also what's happening is there really isn't much fresh immigration in Lawrence. There is this, what I'm saying is that there is this wave of activity and immigration right after the Civil War, and that kind of imprints on the town for years to come because there's very little change. There are only a few people coming in. Lawrence from 1875 to 1940 is a very conservative, quiet, relatively stable sort of place, and so there aren't any new immigrant groups really that come in large numbers, and so that's not as much of a problem. In the same way with blacks, the black population peaks in 1880 and it declines from then on. So that group is basically, they're facing discrimination and lack of opportunity, and so they're leaving, usually to go to metropolitan areas like Kansas City to escape discrimination and find opportunity in the form of jobs and education and so on. Yes?
Going back to the rental properties, I was just wondering if you had said about the jobs and that kind of thing. Did they build them maybe specifically for their more skilled workers? Or
Why don't you
you're not
repeat
sure?
the question so
Okay.
everyone...
Is in reference to the two groups of rental houses that I mentioned, and also the fact that the Fourth Ward becomes the largest concentration of rental housing. And the Fourth Ward is north of 9th Street to the river, east of Massachusetts Street to Delaware, basically. I haven't done the close linkage. It seems very likely that when Bowersock was building houses, clearly he was building houses for both to make money through rental, but also to provide housing for people who would probably work in his plants. I would imagine it was kind of company housing, probably informal.
That's what I was wondering.
J.N. Roberts, for example, is the fellow that built what we now know as the Castle Tea Room, the stone building. That is the Roberts house. So he was also more of a land and property developer in Lawrence. So he didn't, I don't believe he had connection with industrial enterprise. Yeah, more? Okay.
Thank you.
But I haven't really gone into that in greater detail. Again, there's a lot more work to be done in East Lawrence. This is just a very small little test sample.
Dale, as you mentioned, a number of people were successful in East Lawrence, and by the 1880s, people like the Marx Jeweler brothers were moving to Old West Lawrence. some successful people stayed in East Lawrence, like Mr. Eldridge. Why did they stay?
Well, Mr. Eldridge had his troubles, too. I mean, he lost the hotel eventually, and maybe that's partly why he stayed. I think there are different reasons for different people. I think it has to do quite a bit with their life cycle, with their children. If children for whom moving to West Lawrence might be a social advantage. If you had, I think, for instance, Julius Fisher had marriageable daughters, and I think West Lawrence was probably a better home for him and his family and his daughters than East Lawrence. Maybe that wasn't a concern for Eldridge, but I think it's a different story for different people.
Well, thank you very much. That concludes the first part of our sessions this evening, and we look forward to other questions and answers from you, Dale. Thanks a lot. Welcome again to the Biography of a City. This is the second portion of session 3. David Katzman will be talking to us this evening about work and working in Lawrence. Dr. Katzman is Chair and Professor of American Studies and Courtesy Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Kansas. He has been at KU since 1969 and has been a visiting professor at the University College Dublin in Ireland, University of Birmingham in England, Tokushima University, Japan, and the University of Hong Kong. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Ford Foundation Fellow, and the recipient of 2 NEH Fellowships. He is a member of Phi Beta Kappa and an elected Fellow of the Society of American Historians. He co-edits the journal American Studies. He is the author of a number of books, including Before the Ghetto, Detroit in the 19th century, 2 editions, 73 and 75, 7 Days a Week, Women and Domestic Service in Industrializing America, published in 1978 and again in 1981. He is the co-editor with William Tuttle of the book Plain Folk, The Life Stories of Undistinguished Americans in 1982, co-author of 3 Generations in 20th Century America, 1977, 1978, and the second edition in 1982, and co-author of A People and a Nation, the fifth edition, 1998. He is also credited Technical Knowledge in American Culture, Science, Technology, and Medicine since the early 1800s, and that was published in 1996. His current research is on race, ethnicity, identity, and work during industrial America, focusing on the African American working class. Dr. Katzman, welcome.
Thank you, Dennis. Can we show the outline? I want to start with a question of what is work, so that we have some sense about what we are talking about and who we're including in our discussion. What is work? I don't have an idea. Are we working now? Am I working now? Are you doing work by sitting, watching, and in the classroom? How would we define work? Anyone have any idea? Well, what isn't work then? If we can't define it, what would we not include in work? Sleeping. Although if you're paid to test mattresses, it might be work. But why wouldn't we include sleeping ordinarily in work? Little investment of effort, but is there also something more than just effort? Because I can think of some things that are non-work. We use the notion of leisure and leisure time and differentiate it, and there's a lot of physical exertion that people put into labor. So what might we, why would we differentiate that sleep or leisure from work?
Not necessarily monetary. You get, if you did housework, you get room and board for your housework. You watch a child, you can get room and board. There is some kind of material reimbursement for your effort.
Okay, so that there is some benefit that is going to come from it. And ordinarily we think of it, to extend that a little, right, that the benefit is beyond ourselves. One of the things about leisure is that the benefit tends to be just for ourselves, that there is some benefit that goes beyond ourselves. And also there is some notion of productivity or creativity in the process. What's important is, and has been mentioned, is it doesn't necessarily have to involve money and being paid, though for a long time when we tended to look at work in this society or any other society, when people looked at work, they tended only to look at people who were being paid, and therefore tended to include a lot of work in looking at American society. It takes place within some social scope, the degree to which it benefits other people in some way, the degree that there's a purpose to it, and it tends to be productive in some way. We also tend to not include, though I would include in my definition, voluntary work, people who contribute their time, often as well as people who do part of labor that's not counted in the economy. And there's an important part when we look at some of the gender qualities of work. Why do people work? Why do people work? Something, well, what is that thing to do? What is the benefit that it's just something to do?
Well, you're occupying your time a day and learning new skills and ways of thinking.
Okay, so for yourself, it means that you can learn some skills. What about the people you work with?
You develop working relationships.
Working relationships. So at one level, we have family and home, but another level, we have the work relationships. And people often spend more time in the workplace than they do in any other place, so that becomes very critical. In fact, one of the things we know, to take the negative part of what happens to people who are unemployed and suffer from depression and suffer from withdrawal often, because taken away from them are those workplace relationships that are very important. What other motivating forces are there for people to work?
To pay for the rest of my life.
Work for money to pay for, to be able to purchase, in a sense, shelter, food. It is a means to acquire other things, and therefore to sustain, as I put in the outline, to sustain physical life, so that it's a place to meet people, to converse. It's a place that we earn a living, as it's called. That money can purchase other things. Are there other qualities to work that are important, that lead us to seek work?
Can lead to self-actualization.
So what do you mean by self-actualization?
Well, some exertion perhaps on one's part where you can realize potential that one has that you wouldn't otherwise be able to showcase if you're just sitting at home.
It's an area of growth in our lives. And there are many areas of growth. There are many for these things, of which work is one of them, and a very important source, just as family. Other people, not necessarily universal, some people find that it imposes order into their lives, the degree to which we can manage our life by compartmentalizing and having structure in our world. It also offers us, in many different ways, for different people, to contribute to the larger society. We can contribute by growing. We can contribute by the things that we produce. It's also important in terms of personal meaning as well. We often get our identity from the work we do. Often outside of campus, people, to break the ice when they meet someone, they ask the question, what do you do? On campus, people often ask major. But it isn't so much that people are interested in the major or what you do. They're using it as a surrogate for saying, who are you? I want to know who you are. And a conventional, polite way is by starting out by saying, what do you do? In part, it's a reflection that work is so important in our lives, that it is not our only identity. We have many identities, but it is a major, critical identity. The sociologist Everett Hughes has written, a man's work, and we might say a woman's work as well, but he wrote, a man's work is as good a clue as any to the course of his life and to his social being and identity. The money we earn places us in a particular place in society. We derive status from the work we do. We derive many, many benefits about ourselves. So work is one of those critical elements in our society, and it isn't just what we do, but it helps determine who we are. So people work for many purposes, and it has a great impact on us individually. Question, I think, though, for us focusing on Biography of a City is not just on individuals, but the impact of work on Lawrence. And I start with a question of what is that impact? And in some ways that could be a review of Dale's lecture, which gave us really a critical place of work in Lawrence. What was that critical place? How can we have a sense and look at Lawrence through the importance and impact of work? Yes.
Well, just like work can define a person's personality, it can define a city's personality also. If Lawrence would have stayed more industrial, then it would have been known more as an industrial city, where when the university kind of took over as the main thing in the city, it became a real cultural
Okay, that's for the whole
place.
city. Did Lawrence in any way spatially organize itself around work? Well, let me ask the question, did East Lawrence organize itself in any way around the working patterns in Lawrence?
You have certain areas where industrialization is concentrated, like along the river, you would have had the Consolidated Barbed Wire Company, and if people needed to get to work, they would have lived closer to that manufacturing center.
Okay, so some people live there because of its proximity to where they work. I will even suggest that some people live there because it was further away from where they work, but that I jump ahead in my story. But clearly, it has an impact on organizing spatially, where people could afford homes and their neighborhoods take on reputations. Those reputations may not be true, but they take on Old West Lawrence as a merchant area, East Lawrence as a working class area, the same with North Lawrence. This also then affects, for instance, your work affects status, affects how much money you have, affects, in fact, your chances of what kind of school you might go to, who could afford to send their children to university or not. Later on, as Dale indicated, the automobile changed Lawrence. It affected who got an automobile first, who could then jump away and live beyond walking distance from downtown because they had an automobile and private means of transportation. In fact, in the late 19th century, often people who lived closest to downtown were merchants. And many workers, if you go out on some of the streets further away, often had to walk further downtown. They might be closer to the river and a plant than the merchants, which reverses what is the 20th century pattern. So work's impact is not only, the impact of work is not just on individuals, but also is on the society we live on, and specifically is one of those forces that organizes the spatial divisions in Lawrence. Where did people work in 19th century Lawrence? Clearly, one major place where people worked was in the retail trade, which centered on Massachusetts Street. Lawrence started where much of, we might say, people were employed in the commercial district. Lawrence was a small 19th century of less than 10,000 people. It also had the benefit of being the county seat, which brought people into Lawrence, which helped expand the retail trade, which was not just for people in Lawrence, but also in the surrounding agricultural district, and it had the university. Now, the university is a major industry today, but prior to World War II, the University of Kansas was relatively small. And in fact, towns traditionally, when they were founded in the 19th century, their first choice was to be the state capital. State capital. Anyone know what the second choice that most towns competed for when states were organized? The prison. Prison produced more jobs than the university. So Lawrence lost out, and it got the university, which just wasn't the economic engine that a prison and the state capital would provide. But still, that people into the community. The German community in Lawrence provided much of the merchant community in the 19th century, and Katja Rampelman has described much of the German community in the 19th century and focused on that Massachusetts Street merchants. In part, many of these merchants brought some capital with them to Lawrence, relatively modest. These were perhaps peddlers and traders who came to a new town and were able to establish a shop, but nonetheless they had the capital to do that, and they employed people in their shop. Some of the people they employed might live over the shop into the early part of the 20th century. At first the merchant lived there, move out, and then people who worked in the store would move out. By and large, Massachusetts Street was the center of the retail district, but there was another retail district as well. And there was a black business district in Lawrence from the 1880s on that centered in what is today the 800 block of Vermont. Now, there were some black businesses on Massachusetts Street, a number of them focusing on the 600 block, but those black businesses had white customers and white patrons, whereas the black business district in the 800 block of Vermont, which included King's Hotel, built in 1900, included a restaurant, a barbershop, a boots and shoe dealer. Those basically had a black clientele. So one of the things that this tells us about work in Lawrence and in much of the United States is that race and ethnicity were a factor. The German merchants found an economic niche, one that was kind of at the top in the 19th century, whereas blacks were limited in the kinds of jobs that were open to them and in their ability to patronize many shops. So this encouraged black business, but also reflected the degree that African Americans in Lawrence were cut off from both work opportunities and some of the shops. Now, much of the retail stores in the 19th century were locally owned. If you went into the shop, you probably dealt with the owner, which also meant that your customer relations were a little different. For instance, if I went into one of the shops downtown, let's say Weaver's, and I saw a shirt that I want to buy, and it was for sale for $30. And I said to the guy in the store, I like that shirt. I'll offer you $22 for this shirt. What do you think they would do? I don't know, maybe call up Lawrence, one of the places, and say, we have a crazy customer here. And I'll get to why that happens. But in the 19th century, the shops were owned by, or were, you were served by an owner of the shop, most likely, and therefore you could bargain, especially in a grocery store. At the end of the week, if they're going to close on a Saturday, they sold everything at half price. Or butcher shops in the 1870s and 80s and up through the 1890s, you tended to order some of your meat in advance, and the local shop would slaughter to meet their orders. Maybe they'd have some left over. So perhaps they worked and closed early on a Wednesday or a Thursday after slaughtering, and therefore they sold some of this meat they didn't have orders for at a cheap price. A lot of bargaining. Today, we're very uncomfortable bargaining. Probably buying an automobile is the one place where we bargain most, and we've lost those skills, and we're very uncomfortable. So the way shops were run in the 19th century, the owner was there, but that began to change after the turn of the century. And you began to get chains coming into Lawrence. Sears came, and Penny's, and A&P, and then this accelerated in the 1920s. And that changed the environment in which people worked. It's one thing when you work alongside of the owner in a retail store. It's another thing when you're now working for something that is owned and controlled through Chicago, let us say, or New York. And again, I'll come back to that. But the work environment is beginning to change as national chains come into Lawrence. We can see some of these changes appearing in transportation, manufacturing, as Lawrence moved in manufacturing from local control to regional control and then national control in some of the firms in Lawrence. The best place of seeing this actually nationally happened in the railroads. And the railroad comes to Lawrence in the 1860s, and the railroad is kind of the first modern corporation. Like many of the corporations that we would be familiar with in the late 20th century, the railroads were the first bureaucratic corporations that were centrally controlled. And you had to have it that way. You couldn't allow an engineer to use his own advice and send out this train on a track at 50 miles an hour and say, use your advice. It takes a mile or two to stop a train. So everything had to be planned. In fact, the United States, not until World War I, does the United States use a standardized system. Can you imagine if one engineer going east thinks it's 1 o'clock and the other engineer thinks it's 1:30, and so they expect the track to be vacant? Or you need to be concerned that the track and its bed is put in the exact way that engineers have designed it so it can take the weight of a 50,000-pound train, something that didn't exist prior to the train. So very safety had relied that there had to be an engineer 1,000 miles away who figured out all these things. So what the railroads introduced was replacing the judgment of the worker for some preconceived plans that the worker worked to. Worked by the book, worked by rules. So you didn't say to a guy, use your judgment in laying the track. You worked to plans that an engineer figured. So one of the themes that changes in work between the 19th and 20th century is a tension and fight over who controls work. And that many of those people who worked in the late 19th century in Lawrence controlled their work tasks. But with national chains coming in and railroads and so forth, people began now no longer to control their work tasks, but were being asked to work by the book. Other industry in Lawrence that, and Dale has mentioned some of them, the barbed wire. Milling was very important. We're in an agricultural area, and so there were a whole number of mills. The foundry, which was a part and supported the barbed wire, but also was very important for the making of agricultural implements. The dream of everyone, of course, was that if you could have a successful factory, you would be selling what you made in Topeka and Kansas and Denver and so forth. David Darry, in his book on Lawrence, tells the story of a firm who had such dreams and were modestly successful, and the story of the Wilder brothers, who in the 1870s began to manufacture custom shirts and men's underwear. They had learned the trade in the East and came here and opened up making made-to-order garments, men's shirts. They hired traveling salesmen to cover Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas, and they managed to sell to bartenders and fire companies, so they had a specific market. And they were very successful, clearly taking advantage of some of advantages of scale, as well as quality, yet mass-producing these ready-made garments. They were able to find market. They then opened up in the 1880s a laundry next door, which was an extension of their shirt because you had to launder the shirts before you sold them. So if they laundered it themselves, they would save money, but also they could take in other people's laundry and do part of that business as well. And then they also did mail order, extending beyond where their traveling salesmen went. There were a few laundries west of the Mississippi when they built their 1881 three-story plant, which was finished in 1883, and they employed over 100 people making shirts. Then they began to manufacture shirtwaists and ladies' underwear as well, and they were one of the largest custom firms in the country. In 1896, they incorporated as the Wilder Brothers Shirt Company with a capital of $100,000. But they were already in decline, as we can see in retrospect. Charles Wilder died in 1899, but their real difficulty was not so much his death, but their inability to adapt to technology and keep up with the competition. So mass production of shirts soon took more and more of their market, and in 1916, a boom year for manufacturing because of World War I, they closed their doors. Classic case, so they were able to expand, take a bigger piece of the market, but then someone beat them out. And this was typical of many Lawrence firms. But what we see here is very typical, that they were able to adapt to new processes up to a point, and then some regional firm were able to compete better. For our purposes, the closing of the Wilder Brothers meant that over 100 jobs were lost in Lawrence. And it begins to tell us something about, we'll get to, again, the insecurity of workers in the 19th and 20th century. Lawrence was also a major center for finance and the J.B. Watkins Bank, and that was a small white-collar operation which was involved in mortgage lending and agriculture in over a 12-state area. Transportation played an important role, not just the railroad and as a college town, but horse wagons, and there were liveries in town. And later the automobile began to change spatially where people worked in the city. And in the 1910s and the 20s, you could go by trolley car to Topeka and City. So we see a little commuting on a small scale in Lawrence as well. One industry which thrived, helped Lawrence thrive, as it did every town in the United States, a basic industry, was construction. Always a major factor in good times in the United States, and often economists have argued that the downturn in construction often explains depressions, hard times. When construction turns down and the business cycle goes down, that's a classic definition of hard times. The university was not a major factor in Lawrence really until World War II. You can see that there were about 3,000 or so students at Lawrence up until and through the start of World War II. And of course, the university then jumped into, it doubled in size during World War II and began to take off as universities became major research centers. Turning now to the actual work that people did in Lawrence and in Kansas. I hope some of you have read. You've had a group of readings that really discuss women's work. Minnie Eberle's diary and Della Noel's diary in the 1870s and 1890s. The selection on the college professor's wife, very apt to Lawrence. Rampelmann's the section on German women in Lawrence. And then Zorbau's A Girl from Emporia, about a young woman going from Emporia to Chicago in the 1920s. What do these readings have in common? What were in common about the work that these women did? Or if you haven't read it, if you know about women's work in the late 19th century, what are some of the elements involved in the work that women did in the late 19th century, continuing pretty much till World War II?
Most of it involved the domestic sphere of keeping the house running.
Okay, so much of it was domestic. And if we could break that down a little, you think of housewives?
Yeah, housewives, doing the washing, the cooking, the cleaning, keeping everybody fed and clothed, those two major.
Kind of the light work away from the real, they weren't doing the real work of building American society,
That's
right?
how they were perceived, but...
Well, but is it perceived? What about some of your readings for today? Do you have a sense of the hours that were kept in some of this work, or the physical demand that was involved?
Extremely monotonous. Having the same weekend.
Some of it was monotonous, though there were some advantages that women created by being able to work with other women sometime. Some of them in the diaries, right? And Minnie Eberle tries to vary. And she doesn't always do the same task on the same day. But some of it was extremely physical. So physical that if people could afford it, they hired people to do it. So that, and some of the cooking, notice how early people got up? Right? I mean, I don't know how you get your coffee or tea or boiled water in the morning. But in the days of coal or wood-burning stove, somebody had to get up to make sure that there was a fire hot enough to cook and boil water for coffee or tea. They got up much earlier than most people get up today. More like people in rural areas get up. The physical demand of this work. Those complaints about being tired because they were exhausted. And it required an incredible variety. You had to know those domestic skills and horticulture and understand all of these things. Required tremendous variety and strength. Why did they take these jobs? Why did they? I mean, the college professor's wife. Why did she take a job?
Because you didn't have choices.
Didn't have choice. One of the things, even some of the work she didn't prepare for, we have a sense, right, that she went to college, and she complains that she never learned to sew until she had to do it. So there was a gendered notion of work, some work open to men, some work open to women, some work not open to women, some work not open to men, but the most valued work tended to be closed to women. There was a small range of work. There was some professional work, teaching and nurses that were open, and we see, as in Della Knowles working for her father, the postmaster, that she could do some white-collar work, but by and large, there was not a great deal of work. And because it was unpaid labor, we normally value less unpaid labor than we do paid labor. And in fact, in our national accounting, today the gross domestic product, but the gross national product, as we retrospectively looked at the late 19th century, we don't value unpaid labor. That doesn't go into the way economists construct the economy. So, in one sense, a woman often went from the household or family of her parents to that of her husband. But that doesn't describe anyone. Most of the reading you have today are middle-class women who are doing the work themselves. And one of the things technology is going to do is actually place a greater burden on them. It will free them from hiring help and force them to do it themselves. The other pattern is that there are a lot of young women who are working for someone else, and they generally come from the working class. And many of them literally, until compulsory education laws in the 1920s keep them in school, many of them literally were girls. One of the differences kind of between the working class and the middle class is the age at which you become employed. The notion in an agricultural society like Kansas was that young men were productive on the farm because they were extra hands for their father. But there was only how much the family economy could absorb young women. This is a perception, because even as you saw in Minnie Eberle, she made butter and churned and sold things on market. But the perception was that as young teenage girls got older, they were more consumers than producers. And therefore, one way of having them work would place them in a home in town, someone who could provide the moral environment for them as well. And so they received very little pay because they were seen as consumers, but it was also seen as a way of apprenticing to learn those household skills that they would need later on. One of the results is that in around 1900 in the United States, most of the women who worked for pay outside the home tended to work prior to marriage. Most married women worked in the home, not for pay, and it was extremely unusual for a married woman with children to work for pay, whereas, as you know, by the 1970s, that becomes the norm in American society, and women working changes radically. Men's work was gendered as well. The most common occupation in the United States and in Lawrence was that of day labor, someone working in construction work. It means insecurity. You don't work when it rains. You might not be able to find a job every day, even if the weather is good. It was physical work, but you did have the advantage of control over the work, and it paid poorly. Indeed, one of the things, and we see in Colgrave's Carpenters, when someone asked about the people who worked in the barbed wire factory and what happened to them, people typically in the late 19th and early 20th century didn't have one occupation. Not only was work cyclical in the United States, but most work was seasonal. So that people, when they worked in the 1870s and 80s, often had more than one place they worked, even if they were lucky enough to be working in some of the new factories. So construction was among the most important arenas for people to work in the United States, and it involved both unskilled labor, as in day labor, and it also involved, however, tradesmen as people lucky enough to carpenters. Carl Graves, in his work looking at carpenters in the Sunflower State, notes that the work was seasonal, that it was scarce in winter. It was in specific, it responded to the cycles of boom and bust, of what we call depression in the 20th century, but was called hard times prior to the 1930s. As Dale has mentioned, some of your reading, there was a major hard times in the 1870s. Again, it was repeated in the 1880s and dominated much of the decade, and a major hard times in the 1890s. In fact, people look at European history, look at that whole period as one long depression, one long period of hard times. People were more likely to be out of work more than they worked. The seasonal work and cyclical is that if you, given those hard times, it was very difficult for carpenters, as Graves described it to us, to save money to get them through those hard times. The good times were not good enough that they could sock money away for those periods of hard times. Carpenters, to a great extent, were often self-employed, and that meant that they had great control over their work tasks. It led many to be contractors, but also it emphasized the degree to which carpenters in the late 19th and early 20th century tended to be part of a local market rather than a regional and national market. So there is a time lag. They're less affected from some of these regional and developments that other occupations are. But that seasonality to their work and the cycles is to continue into the 20th century. All of this meant for workers that they lived in a period or experienced a great deal of insecurity. And your readings focus on two particular aspects of that insecurity. One, Bill Graydon's Retirement and the Origins of Age Discrimination, deals with discrimination against the aged under the traditional work system prior to industrialization. People, as they got older, were more valued because of their knowledge, the tradition they had, and their skills. Do recognize also that we talk about older prior to the 19th century. We're talking about in their 40s, not people who are beginning the life, people beginning to live to a much greater age. But with industrialization, greater skill was needed in terms of dexterity and speed, and the whole process of production became faster and faster, that older workers became to be valued less and less. One of the great fears in the 19th century for workers was to live beyond their productive capability. They couldn't save enough money for retirement, so the issue for workers in the 19th century wasn't retirement. It was the fear that they would live beyond their ability to work, and then who would support them? But now you begin to again at the turn of the century, and in the 20th century, one, people who are living beyond their productive life, they're still productive, but no longer do employers value their productivity, so they are forced to be unemployed. And two, they're beginning to live beyond even the normal cycle. And so we're beginning to get a shift in we might call structural unemployment, the old, those who are aged. At the same time, we're beginning to see that the business cycle and large corporations, the impact it has with the business cycle, as with the Great Depression. And one of the themes that Fearon deals with in terms of Kansas in the 1930s is that the economic problems were so severe that they were beyond the ability of charities, of local government, and even the state government to deal with the issues. And the issue basically was unemployment and poverty that resulted. And that and this is in a state, Kansas, which, because it was an agricultural state with less urban areas, experienced the Depression far less than had other areas. One impact on working people was that in the 1920s in Kansas, and as in everywhere else, there was a rural to urban migration. Lawrence grew, but it isn't just growth, it's the turnover. People are moving from Lawrence to go to cities, Kansas City, even some Chicago, but they are being replaced by other people who from smaller agricultural towns are coming into places like Lawrence and other Kansas towns. We estimate nationally during the 1920s that about 20 million Americans moved from rural area to urban areas. In the early part of the Depression, beginning in 1930, that trend is reversed. And you begin to have people moving back to rural areas, at least where they can support themselves through agriculture at a marginal level. Workers responded to this in a number of ways, and just to touch on that we don't see merely workers as victims, but in fact play an active role. One was to organize. Organization in the middle and early part of the late part of the 19th century, much of it focused on the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor, which peaked in the 1880s, organized as producers. That is, it wasn't just workers, but there was a place for housekeepers, for consumers, because they saw the role was between producers and those who had capital. To a great extent, the Knights of Labor did not accept capitalism. They were looking to turn around American society, to focus on cooperatives, to focus on a producer's society. Number of national strikes in the 1880s, which in fact came to Kansas in railroads. But the Knights of Labor failed in their major strike in 1887 and thereafter fell. And what took their place were American Federation of Labor, and again Carl Graves in his work talks about the organization of carpenters. And here the focus, the AFL accepts capitalism. And their goal is to improve the bargaining position of workers when resisting the system. And so they are a working people's voice for the workers rather than that of producers in society. And by and large, Kansas is a state in which is never a major unionized state, though there is an attempt in the early 1920s, period from 1920 to 1923, when the state of Kansas creates an industrial court, which mandates arbitration in all labor disputes. But the Supreme Court strikes, the United States Supreme Court strikes that down in 1923 because compulsory arbitration recognized is like a form of slavery. You disagree with your employer, the state then says, you must go. And if you lose, you still have to work. So it creates a slavery. The court then also said that it interferes with free bargaining, so that attempt to have the state control working conditions fails. After the Depression, to a great extent, work both in American society and in Kansas is to change in some radical ways. Much of that brought about by World War II and changes in the economy. One place we can begin to see a major change is because there are more than 14 million men who go into the armed services and about 1.5 million women who do, but there is going from the most severe depression in the United States, in which 1/3 of Americans are unemployed in 1933, and in 1939 it is about 15%, but by 1942 there's a shortage of labor in the United States, and therefore there's industrial factory jobs open up for women for the first time in a major scale in the United States. The war also is to bring about change in education. Not only KU, but all universities are to grow tremendously. And so one of the results of that is you have women increasingly well educated in American society, but finding that while some discrimination has ended, much of it has not. And this educated group of women are going to begin to challenge the restrictions on women in the 1950s and 60s, continue to challenge that. And that is with the women's movement rising in the 1960s to radically change the opportunities for women in American society. One of that is to reach the point in the 80s and 90s today where it is the norm for a married woman with children to work in American society for pay outside her home than it had been before. We also see in the concentration of large corporations the expansion of bureaucratic work and white-collar work. There's also a premium placed on knowledge in the workplace, and the expansion of universities that is to transform work in American society, and clearly has a tremendous influence on Lawrence as the university becomes one of the dominant employers in the city of Lawrence, and much of the expansion that the city is to experience in the post-war period is related to the university, though not completely. Another fact is the degree to which we become a service economy in which fewer and fewer produces, whether in the agricultural sector or manufacturing sector, and more people are involved in the service. One of the largest industries in Lawrence, Hallmark Cards, reflects those changes that take place in American society in terms of the what are they selling? They're selling sentiment, and it is commercialization of that sentiment, and so they're manufacturing, this light industry is manufacturing something that was done by people. I mean, today if you tend to give someone a handmade card, they might likely say, are you too cheap to buy a card? In the 19th century, if you gave someone a manufactured card, they would be insulted because you're giving someone else an expression which should come from you. So we've turned around some in the 20th century. Also, you're reading, and don't have time to discuss, but I think it's very important, is Leidner's on McDonald's and the routinization of work that occurs. Some people have called it first the McDonaldization of the United States and the world. McDonald's is here in Lawrence. It's an important employer, but the kind of approach they have is very important because it's beginning to counter some of the security that workers achieved after World War II. Most people work part-time. They're without benefits, and they are without health care, which is tied to full-time employment in American society. So the kind of employment that McDonald's provides represents the kind of insecurity that most workers had in the 19th century, and also reflects the degree that it is totally routinized. Some learn to cook a hamburger. They follow a manual, and as you read Hamburger University, they've been trained. They do it exactly so you want it that way, because you want to go in any McDonald's anywhere in the world and get the same product. The only way you can do that is ask people not to use their judgment. Also, Lawrence and work is changing, and workers in Lawrence is changing, because Lawrence is also becoming a bedroom community. There are communities. There are people who work for state government in Topeka and chose to live in Lawrence rather than Topeka. And now there are people who are seeking out a university community, a small town, and working in Kansas City and elsewhere. and see Lawrence as a bedroom community. And so some of the expansion of Lawrence comes externally rather than internally. Work then in the 1990s and in the next century, as we look ahead, seeing that security and insecurity, rather than being able to see a single trend, we clearly see security in terms of Social Security, health insurance, when eventually it comes with the government, as I believe it will, pensions and vacations that come with work. And also, workers expect today, since World War II, to work 52 weeks of the year. When people are laid off, they're surprised, whereas that was what workers expected prior to World War II. But insecure work itself, because work changes more rapidly. Few of you will have one career. If any of you have had parents who've had one career, you're unlikely to have that. You will have 2 or 3 careers. Many careers that you might start with are going to disappear. And also increasingly part-time work. And also we have virtual work sites. With technology, many people are going to be working at home. If you realize then where we started off, some of the functions of work. Work is changing so rapidly that it is beginning to take away from some of those social functions that work had. Someone who works alone or works part-time does not have the same work community that people had and valued so much in the 19th century. One of the things that I hope I've suggested is that as work and work life has changed in Lawrence, it's not necessarily for the better. It's not just simple progress that isn't it great in the 1990s that we've accomplished. What technology and change has brought to a great extent is a mixed bag. It has brought benefits, it has brought greater wealth to those working full-time, but it's also created in a modern industrial society many people who don't have full-time work, many people who don't have those advantages that come with regular work. Where this will lead in the future, I can't say. But one of the things I think we need to do is look at the past in Lawrence and see it as a resource to try and preserve some of those elements that make work life important and at the same time move ahead with technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katzman. Why don't we go into the question and answer period for the final portion of the tape, and then we'll continue on there. Students?